by Riverside.
Welcome to another episode of Leadership Bites podcast, where we share the inspiring stories of women leaders across diverse backgrounds, industries, and career stages. And today I am very pleased to introduce you all to Gwen Fortune Blakely. Gwen is the Chief Membership and Engagement Officer at the Association, of Immunologists. I'll just call that AAI for short. Her career path has taken her from Fortune 500 companies to nonprofit associations, and her previous roles include Vice President of Marketing at the Bipartisan Policy Center, Director of Enterprise Marketing and Sales at the American Speech, Language, and Hearing Association. And also, she's been the Senior Director of Brand Strategy at Marriott International. In her current role, Gwen leads AAI's marketing, communications, and membership initiatives. And in addition to her career achievements, Gwen also holds an MBA in marketing from UCLA's Anderson School of Business, and she's a certified association executive. We are so pleased to have you with us today, Gwen. Thank you for joining.
Yeah, no, I'm so pleased to be invited. Thank you for the invitation.
All right, well, let's just dive in. I would love to start off by talking a little bit about leadership and vision with you. You are a leader who has led transformational change across Fortune 500 companies, as I mentioned, and also now nonprofit associations. I'm curious about your approach to defining and communicating a powerful vision that really gets people on board.
Yeah, no, I mean, that is so key. I think, to inspire teams and have everybody perform at their best, they really need to understand, what the vision is and how they're going to contribute to that vision. I love strategy. I love basing things in a mission. And I really make sure that, my teams understand what the strategic plan is, understand what their role is in driving that strategic plan forward, and we also spend a lot of time each year really thinking about reassessing, where are we in that plan? What do we know about what's going on or what's happened since the last time we wrote the plan? And what are the things that are key drivers that will cause us to do something differently? So I just really make sure that people are very intentional about what they're doing.
Yeah, awesome. Awesome. And what are the key ingredients you think are critical for building consensus and mobilizing your team? Because you mentioned the strategic plan, and a big part of making that successful is being able to get everybody moving in the same direction, right? So,
Right,
how do you
right.
do that when you're in the midst of organizational shifts?
Yeah, I mean, it's really key to make sure that you're listening, and I always tell my team that to have a successful meeting, you're having multiple conversations before you ever get to that meeting, because you want to make sure that the people that you're leading, that you're inspiring, are grounded in the data, the information, the insights, and then your why. And once you have that kind of mutual understanding, then there's a basis from which you can, have people buy into what you want to do. So I just make sure that I take people and I tell my team to take people through the journey so they understand these are the insights. This is why they matter. This is behind what we're doing. Hear what they have to say about that. They may change a little bit your perspective. And then when you end up in the plan, if they've gone on the journey with you, then they have buy in, and then make them understand how critical they are to it. But you really have to take people on the journey with you as opposed to just handing them a list of things you want them to do because of the plan that you developed. So a lot of the journey is learning from other people and listening, but it's also developing that buy-in because they understand the fundamentals and they've taken the path with you.
Yeah. What's a transformation project that you've had, if you've had one,
Mhm.
which I'm sure you have
Yeah.
in your career, that you're really proud of? And what do you think were the key components of making that work well for you?
Yeah, I mean, most of the things that I'm really been proud of are grounded in data. So I started out my career actually in research, and then I moved into like product development, business development, and then into the nonprofit world. So some of my proudest moments have really been when I've been able to take the things that I learned in other contexts, like a Marriott, and then bring them into the nonprofit world because it's so critical when you have a mission, and it's so critical to take some of those tools that corporations use and apply them where it really matters because you're driving the mission. So, one example was when I was at the American Speech Hearing Association. I used the information that I learned at Marriott about propensity modeling and applied that because we had a wonderful database and a really large, group of members, but really applied that to understand and have scores about the actions we wanted them to take. What do they have the highest propensity of action to take, so that you can tailor then your messages, your offers, and what you're serving up based on their propensity to take an action, which was based on studying folks who have taken those actions before and developing models. So what I loved about that is that it was a very sophisticated approach, and really helped us, in an environment where we're trying to help our members. So rather than just selling something, doing a better
Mhm.
job of serving them. So I love taking things that I've learned in the corporate environment and then applying them in the nonprofit space to make us more efficient and effective at what
Mm.
we do.
I love that, the idea of that knowledge transfer from industry to
Mhm.
industry. What would be your advice to individuals in terms of being able to get those skill sets and experience and translate them into nonprofit organizations in a meaningful way?
I think that one of the ways is to have a mix in what you do for your professional development. So I love ASAE. It's really important because you have that bonding and information that you can learn from other association professionals. However, mix it up also a little bit and go to some of the professional development that people typically go to in like a corporate environment because you may learn about new tools, consultants or vendors or approaches that might not be readily applied in the association world, but completely have applicability. So I do encourage my team to reach out beyond just the association sphere for learning opportunities. So definitely have your core in the association world because they know the business best, but also reach out and learn, and take those opportunities to learn in environments where you're with a mix of folks that are not just in the association industry.
Yeah, it's great advice there. And when I'm going to take a little bit of a pivot, and I am going to ask you to share a bit about a time where you were working on a strategy.
Mhm.
And as a woman leader, maybe it was met with some resistance. How did you navigate through that, especially in corporate environments, which research has proven less diverse? How have
Mhm.
you
Yeah.
navigated that?
I definitely have had a lot of experience doing that because most of the
Yeah.
environments I was in the corporate environment were not diverse at all. I think one of the things is making sure that you go back to the fundamentals of having people understand the type of training that you have. So if somebody
Mhm.
kind of questions something or jokes about something that you're saying, then oh well, actually from my experience and da 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 da, and and make sure that they understand that you're grounded in experience, whether it was from UCLA, whether it was from Coca Cola, so that they understand that what you're doing is grounded in fundamentals. So I never do it in kind of an abrasive way, but kind of like, oh, well, actually, the experience that I had, it, da, 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 da. And then I think it makes them take a little bit of a step back and be respectful. And then they might ask a question more about what you're doing. But I think it's almost as though you have to wear your credentials stamped across to you, right? And if
Yeah.
people kind of forget those credentials, then in a very polite and maybe even using humor way, you can remind them of that, kind of gain that respect, and then they're listening because they want to hear about that thing that you're talking about that was based in
Mhm.
something. So I've found that sometimes I do have to remind people a little bit, of the background and that my things are grounded in fundamentals. Particularly, even sometimes in the association world, if you're dealing with someone, if you're not the profession that they are, then they may not know that there's actual real tenets behind things and there's real methods. So they might look at a particular word and then you say, oh, well, actually, there's a lot more behind that. Let me explain the concept to you. So I tell my staff that too. I say, don't just, throw a lot of words out. Explain it like, oh, actually, this is a method. Actually, this is how we measure this. Let me explain a little bit to you why this matters. And then educate them a little bit. Don't change your language to something that they'll understand better. Teach them the vocabulary, teach them the concepts, and then put it into plain language in terms of like making sure they understand it. But let them know that there's a science behind how you approach membership, communications, and
Mhm.
marketing. Because if you're based in something that's I have all the admiration and respect in the world for our members because they're like literally carry cancer, right? But then
Yeah.
but then you still can own your professionalism too and tell them like, well, actually there's a little bit of there's an art, but there's also a little bit of science to that and explain it. And they actually appreciate that because a lot of the
Mhm.
folks, particularly in the association world, particularly in the sciences, are learned folks. So when you start to teach them
Mhm.
that, they're like, I get it. And then they jump in and they're excited to participate.
Yeah, love that. Now, you mentioned ASAE's DELT program.
Hmm.
You and I are both alum of that
Right.
program, and I'm curious about mentorship and how it
Mhm.
has shaped your career. How pivotal do you think the DELT program was in terms of your career development? And have you had other mentors that have shaped your career? And if so, can you tell us a little bit how?
Yes, I think that DELP was really critical for me because it was the first time I started to think of myself as an association professional. I kind of came with my lens of, well, this is the thing that I do. I'm bringing this expertise to but I didn't think of myself holistically as an association, professional. I thought, okay, I bring this expertise. And I thought more broadly about the fact that, like, I think I want to be part of like the C-suite,
Yeah.
because not everybody has to be a CEO, but even being the C-suite, you have to have a much broader perspective. So for the first time, I was learning about governance and thinking like an executive director or somebody who's a CEO and having that mindset. And especially the part about having to get your CAE, and
Hmm.
study for that, really kind of broadened my perspective. And then I love the family that Delp offers. That anytime I need help, I can call up a colleague, one of my Delpers, and they are there to help kind of guide me through things. So I love that aspect of it. I will say that in general, as I've come up through my career, I've had people I admire. I have people who've taken an interest in me. I really haven't had like a whole lot of formal mentors, you know.
Hmm.
So I'll just be honest about that, And I came into the DELT program fairly senior in my career, so I feel like I had more kind of relationships with people who were kind of peers, and maybe
Hmm.
someone who's like maybe one level above or something, but not so much because I wasn't coming in, and you do come in pretty senior. I mean, so they do pick a certain type of person for adult, but I was so far along in my career that I actually even asked, my manager when they proposed. I said, "Somebody younger should be." I said, this is a good idea, So I'm glad I did it,
Yeah.
but a lot of times you have to take your inspiration where you can get it, and I have to say that where I've kind of learned and grown the most is by seeing projects that I really think are interesting and work
Hmm.
is very interesting and chasing that. And as
Yeah.
I work with people doing that work, I learn whether it's from, someone who's leading the project or a vendor, and I find opportunities to learn wherever I can. So it's not exactly mentorship in that somebody's shepherding me along or kind of saying, "Hey, look
Yeah.
at this opportunity," but it's more seeing really smart people or who are doing things that you haven't done before, attaching yourself to that, learning as much as you can. And so I've grown a lot from relationships with those folks, but I wouldn't say that I've had a lot of just very traditional mentorship.
I love that you share that. It seems like your path hasn't been very traditional, which is always
No.
exciting to hear. Yeah, it's always exciting to hear about, though. I think those are some of the best stories, actually, that don't follow, a very stringent path from point A to
Mhm.
point B, right? There's some
Yeah.
fun and some action mixed up in there. As a woman leader, I'm sure that you have seen a lot. You have been in these different environments. Is there one myth about women in leadership that you wish you could bust once and for all?
Mhm.
And if so, what is
Yeah.
that?
I think it's the idea that we're not in each other's corner. that there's a competition for the space. I would like to bust that myth because I think that, that there's the sisterhood and helping. And so the idea that we have to compete against each other or that there's only so many folks who are going to be at a certain level. So you've got to, compete. I'd like to bust that because I've had more women who have helped me and shepherded me than I have and competed with me. I've had that too.
Yeah, that's good. That's great. And speaking of your varied path, you are also an author and
Oh,
you
yeah.
wrote a book. Yes. Yeah. Listen, I did my background research.
You did.
You wrote a book titled Rex and the Band. Can you tell
Mhm.
us a little bit about that project? What was the book about, and how does it connect with your broader vision as a woman leader who wants to help other people thrive?
Yeah, well, yes, that project or that book was in me for a very long time, and I'm glad that I got out. And I have more books, but that I want to do. But that really kind of came from me being a mom and not really seeing all the books that I wanted to see for my children. And really, I wanted to write something that was kind of more of a slice of everyday life. A lot of times children's books geared towards African Americans are sometimes just about trauma, and it's not just about the day to day beautiful interactions that you have with your family members. And so I just wanted to do kind of everyday slice of life type of book. And I based it on my dad, a story that my grandma used to tell me about my dad. And then I modernized it because clearly there were no
Okay.
cell phones when my dad so and that book ended up becoming very important to me and my family because it talked about my dad and his journey, and he's an educator in California, or he was. Unfortunately he passed, but that book got picked up by there's schools called the Fortune Schools, and my family has developed a set of charter schools, and so the
Mhm.
book ended up getting kind of picked up, and like the children were reading it, they're doing art from it. The band did a compilation called Rex and the Band. My father enjoyed it, and unfortunately passed from COVID. And even at his funeral, the book was there and the kids performed, Rex and the Band. So it ended up having so much more depth than what I was trying to do with it. I mean, I wanted to share my dad's story and I wanted to have this kind of everyday book, but it ended up becoming so much more than that for my family, for the community that surrounded him. And it ended up being kind of a tribute to my father.
Oh, that's really beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. And I am always curious, when I'm talking with visionary leaders about what you have ahead, like what your journey looks like. What is something that you are currently learning or exploring that you feel like is stretching your leadership muscles?
Yeah. Well, in the times that we're in particular, figuring out when to communicate, what to communicate, and what do we want to take a stand on. My experience in being at a think tank kind of changed my perspective about communications. And typically, if you're in a corporate environment, you talk about communications, not everybody always cares that you're launching a new product, right? So you don't always get the best comms, and stuff. And then in the association world, there's a lot of cool things to say, but sometimes not every association takes advantage of kind of capturing the news cycle. By
Mhm.
being in a think tank where all day long, I had a boss who was a commentator at C-SPAN. So it was all about capturing the news cycle, and the media relations was on steroids. It wasn't, most places you'd be lucky, like, hey, I got a hit in the New York Times. They were like, what were the top flight hits that we got for today? And so every
Yeah.
was Wall Street Journal, New York Times.
Yeah.
It was, and so I really understood and made this connection between marketing, communications, media, and a whole way that I never had before. And then coming into AAI in this time, in this place, it gave me a different perspective in terms of like, how do you be deliberate about saying what you want to say, but also understanding that the news cycle has a certain thing. And if something's going on in the news cycle, take advantage and grab that opportunity to get your message out and it will resonate. And how do you do that? And how do you hire people who know how to do that? Because that's not my expertise, but I know how to hire somebody who knows how to do it. So building a comms team. And then also we started talking about the fact that how do we not just be reactive in this environment? Like especially in right after the election, it was like every Friday night at
Yeah.
6 p.m. It was something coming out. But
Yes.
but then we sat down, and we said, you know what? Let's be intentional. what are the trigger points that will cause us to say something that makes sense for us to say? What are the four messages we want to get out? What are the trigger points that would cause us to say that? And let's write those messages now and be ready so that get all the approvals, get everybody in place so that when it hits, boom, we're ready to talk to this reporter. We're ready to do. And so, one of the things that I'm really proud of that my director of communications worked along with the head of public affairs, and AAI released a vaccine statement where we had 34 other societies sign on with us, and it was in the timing of it, we got picked up, in the media, and we got some really good hits, and our president was out there, and the president of the board was out there speaking, and then we had people who were coming to us saying, "Hey, we saw that vaccine statement. Let's talk to you about how we educate." Parents more about vaccines. So it opened this door to opportunity, but you have to be intentional because we said, okay, we know certain things are happening. We know that vaccines are going to be, challenged or whatever. How do we go about this? Who do we need to partner with? Because we're the science side, so we're the bench, but we need the bedside, right? So who do we partner with and how do we set this up? And so I felt really proud of the team. And what I brought to that was just that intentionality of like, we don't have to sit back and wait for this stuff to happen. We have a roadmap. So let's say, okay, if this happens, what will we say? So we picked our points, funding of biomedical research, protecting the workforce, the scientific workforce, the future force, I think all the young people who lost their jobs, during the probationary status, so what are the trigger points what are the things we want to protect and what would trigger us to take action and being very intentional. And that's why I just say that I love strategic planning, because strategic planning doesn't have to always be this far out or long process. It's like being intentional, having a strategy at all times and being prepared. And so I look at that all as being strategic. And my father started me with that because when I was 10, he started saying, he said, forget about New Year's. On your birthday, I want you to say, what do you intend to accomplish next year? And then I want you to look back and say, how did it go in terms of what you said you're going to accomplish? So we started out when I was 10. So the reason I like strategic planning is because my dad had me doing strategy at the age of 10 and every
I
single year.
love that. That is so good. Oh, wow. That is great. That is great. And I love that you lift that because as someone who has worked in associations for a long time, I think that that has long been an area, in my opinion, where associations and other types of nonprofits have struggled, that having foresight and planning in advance and not being reactive. So I love that as an example of an actionable, tangible way that you have led your organization and your team to do something different, something that is very future focused and strategic. And in talking about the times, the climate that we're in, the landscape is always evolving. Things are always shifting and changing, not just politically, but we're also seeing some ripple effects in the socioeconomic climate. A lot of membership organizations, members are paying out of pocket for their dues. Mm-hmm. And yeah, as consumer confidence gets on shaky ground, so goes the renewals and the joins and mm-hmm. things like that. Are you seeing that? And if so, how is your organization navigating that?
Yeah, and I think that's something we're going to have to stay very cognizant of. I don't know that we're feeling it exactly right now, but that doesn't mean we're not going to feel it later. Particularly if the economy goes into a recession. I think one of the things that we think about when we think about what are we going to say something about, we also think about what do our members need to hear right now. Being intentional about what do we message to them? Each time we say, what's our audience? Okay, we're trying to get into the press here, or we're trying to talk to the administration here, or we're trying to talk to our members about the time that they're in and mm-hmm. tell them that we understand there are some particularly young scientists are like, can I be what I always aspired to be anymore? Their grants are cut and their programs are shut down. And that's really scary, So being there to hear and then telling them what we're doing and then allow them to tell us like, okay, well, I want you to do more. So we've been doing pulse surveys. Loretta, our CEO, she came in to modernize the organization. And then she brought in a C-suite, including myself and others and there hadn't really been a C-suite before. And so one of my things is like making sure we have all the tools. We've got SurveyMonkey, so we can do quick pulse surveys. What do you think about what we're saying? Do you think it's making a difference in your life? Do you think that we're protecting you? What else would you want to do? So making sure that you keep listening to your members, you keep them in your mind in terms of speaking to them, but then also listen back to see, are you hitting the mark? Because for us, community is everything right now.
Yes.
So, so it can't be just about the discount you get because yeah, I mean, and that's kind of where we were. We're like, oh my God, yeah, more
Yeah.
better. But then in this time, advocacy matters. People are paying more attention to our advocacy, but we got to tell people what we're doing and why we're doing it. And I'm not going to say that we have that perfectly figured out, and it's going to get more challenging for sure. But we're being very conscious about listening and hearing our members and trying to understand what can we do for them, but what can we also help them go do.
Yeah, yeah. All of that was very powerful, but I honed in on something you said about young people who are just preparing to come into the workforce. And as I think about that in terms of women leaders who are also navigating a shift, there's been a shift in DEI
Yes.
policy.
Yeah.
We're seeing different direction, and we don't do politics here, so I don't want to get into the politics of it, but I am very curious about your thoughts and advice for specifically women leaders who are coming into the workforce, or maybe they're mid-career and they're or maybe felt like they were just finding their way and hitting their
Right,
stride
right.
and now feel like they've taken a few steps back. Do you have any advice in terms of how to maintain, how to stay the course during this time?
Yeah, I think being a little vulnerable and transparent, because it could be tempting not to talk about this time and what's going on, or to kind of hold to yourself. But I think the transparency is really important. I saw a post on LinkedIn where somebody talked about being rifted, and how they felt that everybody had moved on. Their friends were very empathetic, but then they moved on. Their family moved on. They said even they felt like their dog.
Oh gosh.
but like how what they were feeling and how much they defined themselves by their job, and then other people kind of jumped in, and that was a lot of vulnerability, especially for LinkedIn, right?
Yeah.
But then other people came in and they had commentary, and I think it was cathartic for that person, but I think also as people jumped in with advice, and there may be someone who has an opportunity that may come to that person. So I think being transparent, being vulnerable, and reaching out rather than kind of centering in, and keeping it to yourself, I think is really important.
Yeah. And how do you stay grounded and motivated when life's challenges feel overwhelming?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I sometimes that's when I buckle down the most. Sometimes I think you have to worry about when the crisis is over, because during COVID, I was like with my family, I'm like, okay, you wanted to make Eagle Scout. Okay, I'm going to do my CAE. Okay, you're going to do whatever. I mean, like I had like this tick list. Everybody had, they're applying to grad school, and we were like shitting desks and lamps and stuff, so their friends can come over. And it actually was worse when it stopped, because all of a sudden I do talk to a therapist. I discovered that too, because I didn't really do that before. And I said, why does it feel harder now that the crisis is over? She said, well, because when you're in the crisis, you're like, and then at some point you have to kind of like go, you know.
Yeah,
So
that's
sometimes when
true.
you're in crisis mode, you're like, poof, 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 poof. So I actually was very intentional as I looked at what's going on right now. I took a leadership role in a community organization that I'm in. I look at where my family's at and the transitions, and my children transition to young adults and going out into the workforce. I looked at the leadership role that I'd taken not that long ago with AAI, and the space we were going into, and the challenge with that, in terms of the environment. And I said, you know what? I think I'm going to start those therapy sessions again, because I need to have my big girl pants on 24/7.
I love
and
that.
it's
I
gonna
love
and
it.
it's gonna be hard. So I need someone to talk to. So I will talk about like that, talk through how these interactions are, and then it allows me to kind of stay grounded and be there for the people that I need to be there for, because I'm being there for myself too.
Yeah. That's wonderful advice. Yes, I am all about taking care of your mental health. It is something I'm a big believer in and wholeheartedly advocate. So thank you for sharing that. And I would I have two more questions for you. I know we're approaching time, but I do want to ask you these two questions. One of them's fun, I promise. But the last serious question I'll ask you is if you could go back in time
Mhm.
and talk to your younger self, just starting out in your career, what advice would you give her?
That's kind of interesting because, as you say, I do not have a traditional path. I was all over the place, you know. If I see an interesting opportunity, then I go for it. So I'm gonna kind of just still live in that, you know. It doesn't seem like a big deal now, you know, when you change jobs like a lot. But I mean, back when I started my career, if you moved every 5 years, you're like, wow, what are you doing now? Now
Yeah.
5 years seems like a long time. But you know, I my journey, people will be like, wow, you're all over the place. But then I had somebody reframe it for me. Like I used to talk about the companies. I had my resume by companies, and then it was all this change. And they said, well, look at actually the evolution of what you've done. You've done sales to marketing to strategy to like it all made sense, you know, to
Yeah.
research. When you looked at the top bodies of work that I was doing and the kind of work I like to do, then it made sense. But I felt like I felt a little bit judged by people saying, oh, you're hopping around. But what I realized is that I like change. I like managing through change. Most of the roles I take are brand newly created or
Hmm.
transformed. You know,
Hmm.
most of the roles I take, you know, didn't exist before. And so I'm attracted to that. I'm attracted to building. I'm attracted to new. Um,
Yeah.
and and instead of kind of listening to people say like, "Well, what are you doing? You're all over the place. You know, I can't see the path." Well, I kind of saw the path, but I didn't know I saw the path. I just knew I was attracted to a certain kind of thing. If something looked interesting, I'd go run over to that. One of the times that was the happiest for me was in being at Coca-Cola. Every 18 months, you could change a job. You know, you had to wait for
Wow.
18 months. And I
Yeah.
did it. I'd be like looking at the like, okay. And I was, like, look at that over there. You know, they're doing vending over innovation. Oh, look at over there. It's international. Or, oh, look at there. You know, they're doing new product development. And there was just so many exciting things to do. And it was actually okay for you. And then in one place, you could jump to all these different things
Hmm.
and do these different things. So I think I would tell the younger me like don't really listen to what people are saying. Like it's okay to follow whatever is exciting, and
Hmm.
stuff. Now sometimes you make mistakes, like
Hmm.
you know
Yeah.
sometimes you can make a mistake, but then you even learn from those mistakes.
Yeah.
So I would say kind of relax a little bit. It's okay to just follow. It doesn't have to be this straight line path to something. It just as long as you keep learning and growing, that's okay.
I love that. That so resonates with me. I am a person that, like you, that likes the continual challenge, and I'll stay at a place
Mhm.
for some years, but I have to feel like I'm growing and developing. I don't do well with stagnation at all. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
I feel you on that. Also, the fun question that I did have for you is if your leadership style were an animal, what animal? You gotta throw one in
Okay.
there, right?
Right,
If
right, right.
if your
Okay.
leadership style were an animal, what animal would it be and why?
Okay, so I was just at the San Diego Zoo last week. Let's figure out,
Perfect.
but I know, but like when but I went to go see the koalas and the hippos, and none of those seem very applicable. Let's see. I mean, I don't know why, but like dolphins and things are coming to mind, but I don't know if I can make the really great analogy. I think one thing that's kind of interesting about dolphins is that you always get the sense of that they're a lot smarter than you know. They seem
Hmm.
clever, they seem playful, they seem to
Yeah.
have a sense of humor. They seem like they're a lot more clever and a lot like brighter than maybe people might know that they are, and then they're ever moving and stuff. So I can't make a perfect bow around this, but I kind of like the idea of the dolphin, you know,
Yeah.
and then they
I
kind of
love that.
make a little show, whales do that too. One time I was in a
Yeah.
meeting, and I had the fortune of being in a meeting in Norway, and this guy had his back to the window,
Mhm.
and he was talking about how rare it was for whales to surface, and behind him this whale did this.
Yes.
Oh, and I feel like dolphins and whales know they're doing that. They're like, "Hey, look at this," you know.
Yeah.
So I like the fact that they're playful, that they have a sense of humor, that they're smart, and that every once in a while they want to put on a little bit of a show, show you what they got.
Yes. I love that. I love that. I was gonna say, what was I gonna say? What's that movie? Oh my gosh, it was years ago, but it was like Free Willy or something, and
Yes,
got you. That's all I could think of when you were saying.
the whale. Yeah, Free Willy's the whale. Yeah, killer whale, right?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, that was a throwback for you, right? Well, thank you so much, Gwen. It has been a pleasure talking with you today. Is there any last thing that you want to talk to us about in terms of things that you have coming up that you want to share with the audience, or any last words of wisdom for the podcast audience as well?
And it's just, have confidence and faith in yourself. And if there's something that you think is really interesting, don't hold yourself back. Just go for it. Just go ahead and take that leap, take a chance. I've always found that that's been to my advantage to not be fearful about newness, creating something that hasn't been done before, and then pulling people and engaging people in that process along with you, taking them on the journey with you. I think in these times are going to call for a lot of that and innovation, and also keep hope. Figure out what piece of this that's going on that you want to focus on, and what difference can you make, and try to focus in on that. Because otherwise you could become completely overwhelmed. You know.
I love that. Gwen Fortune Blakely, MBA, CAE, Chief Membership and Engagement Officer at AAI. Thank you so much for joining me today on the Leadership Bites podcast. And viewers, listeners, thank you so much for joining today as well. And I will be back with you in 2 weeks with a new episode. Have a great day.
Great, thank you. Bye.